What is happening, Chiefs Kingdom? Gary McKenzie back at you again with another episode of Gridiron Lines. And in today's episode, I've got something neat for you. We're going to go over history, specifically Super Bowl history in the NFL as it relates to teams who have won 2 Super Bowls within a 4-year stretch of time. So if you've been living in a cave, you might not have noticed that the Chiefs won 2 Super Bowls in the last 4 years. And so I wanted to look at other NFL franchises and see how they performed after accomplishing the feat of winning 2 Super Bowls in 4 seasons. But before we go any further, I want to get to our fan shout out. And last week, there's a bit of a snafu with one of the videos that was posted. Apparently, the title for last week's video that was pushed out for me, it was labeled as though it was one of Seth's videos, and that was our mistake. We're humans, stuff happens. But this fan shout out came because of that. This comment came from that. And Williams Swope says Gary does a great job with stats. Thank you very much. But he's not as expert as Chris Clark on the salary cap. The title to the video indicates it's a Chief in the North video. With all due respect to Gary, he's not as polished as Seth at this point. And I think this is a good way of giving some constructive feedback without being a jerk about it. So I really appreciated this comment from William here. And there's one thing I want to note, and that is that the only reason I started, getting involved in Chiefs blogging to begin with, um, or the only reason I started to get into this space at all was because of Seth. So a long time ago, whenever Seth was writing Arrowhead Pride, I would read his stuff. I thought he did a great job. I thought it was awesome. I loved reading it. Thought he was a great writer. I thought, what, I could aspire to do this. So eventually, Joel Thorman gave me a shot, and I started writing at Arrowhead Pride. And I don't know if I was ever very good, but I always tried to kind of reach the same points that Seth did in my own way. And Seth gave me a lot of good advice over the years in early going that I still use to this day. And so I've always looked up to him. And I think that, I don't think I'll ever, be as polished as Seth is. He's really good at what he does. All I want to do is contribute to my little corner and do my little piece, like know my little role that I have and be as good as I can possibly be. And so that's where I'm coming at. But once again, I don't think this comment was rude in any way, shape, or form. I thought it was very constructive criticism done respectfully and in a nice way. And I really appreciate this because it takes kind of an experienced and high caliber person to be able to offer criticism that is useful and is not just kind of being negative to be negative. And I totally agree. I'm not as polished as Seth. I don't know if I ever will be, but I just want to give Seth a shout out. He's the only reason that I started doing this, or the main reason I started doing this, getting into Chiefs or talking about the Chiefs at all. And so just hat tip to Seth. I think he's awesome. And he's not only a good, Chiefs content creator, he's also just a really good person. And so I can't thank that man enough for the help he gave me early on and then kind of being there at times in my life. So just, I'm not offended by this at all. I totally accept the fact that I'm nowhere near as polished as Seth. But let's get into the meat and taters of our video here. And remember, we're going over NFL franchises that have won a Super Bowl, or NFL franchises that won a Super Bowl in 2 out of 4 seasons. So they could win 2 in a row, they could win one, take a year off, win another, or they could win one, take 2 years off, and then win a fourth. And we're going to look at what happened in these teams. And then lastly, we'll get to the Chiefs. So we'll start with the 1966 and 1967 Green Bay Packers. So this team won 2 Super Bowls in a row, but they did not win any more after those first 2 during their head coach and quarterback tandem. So that's another thing we looked at. Or another thing I looked at was were the head coach and quarterback intact. And in fact, all cases where a team won two Super Bowls in 4 years, the quarterback and I believe head coach had stuck together. So it's each one of these situations kind of looks at it as almost like a dynasty. I don't know if each one of these teams would qualify as a dynasty. I'm not going to jump into that, the whole terminology and all that stuff. I'm just focusing on teams that won two Super Bowls in 4 years. So what happened to these Packers? Bart Starr ended up retiring after the 1971 season. And then after the Super Bowl in 68, his play diminished comparatively. And he was a little older at this time. He's kind of one of the older chain of quarterbacks that were around prior to the merger. And so his play dropped, and that played a role in the Packers not being contention and not winning more Super Bowls. Next, you have the 1972 and 1973 Miami Dolphins. And I thought it was interesting that the Dolphins could have an undefeated season and then win another Super Bowl, so win two Super Bowls in a row, and then kind of fall off the face of the earth. And I was doing some research on my own, and I got to thinking, well, I don't know why this team didn't win more Super Bowls. So I logged on to good old Chat GPT, OpenAI, and I asked it. I asked, why did the Miami Dolphins only win two Super Bowls in the 1970s? And I won't give you the long form, but the short form of the answers were they had key players retire. Larry Zonka, Jim Kick, and Paul Warfield all retired. And then they had stiff competition. So the 1970s Steelers came into the fray shortly after the Dolphins won their second Super Bowl. And then the Raiders and the Cowboys were also there in the 70s as well. So it was a case of Dolphins were great, but they had some really hard competition. And a few key players retired, and that's why they didn't win more in the 70s. And this is a unique team because they are the only team in NFL history where a franchise had a quarterback who was in their prime. So Bob Greasy was in their prime. They won two Super Bowls in 4 years, and they didn't go on to win a fourth. And that's kind of a word salad there. It's a mouthful. We'll cover that again whenever I talk about the Chiefs. So then you had the 74, 75, 78, and 79 Pittsburgh Steelers. Dominant team, steel curtain, Terry Bradshaw, awesome run game. This team was, I would say, one of the most dominant teams in NFL history over a decade. So they won four Super Bowls in a decade, which is just incredible. And they had an incredibly dominant stretch, one because of their defense, but also Terry Bradshaw, who was started with the Steelers, I think, in 1972. He incrementally improved each season. So early on in Terry Bradshaw's career, he was not a great quarterback. In those years, when he wasn't playing very well, the Steelers' steel curtain was unbelievably good defensively. And Terry Bradshaw really didn't need to do much to help the Steelers win those Super Bowls. But as the Steelers were going into the late 70s, Terry Bradshaw was a much better quarterback, and the team relied on him a little more than their defense to win those last two Super Bowls in 78 and 79. So this team that won two Super Bowls in 4 years ended up winning four Super Bowls total with their quarterback, with Terry Bradshaw. So this is kind of good news for the Chiefs because they've won two Super Bowls in 4 years. Maybe they can win four over the next decade. Another team that won four Super Bowls in a decade, the 1980s San Francisco 49ers. So they won in 81, 84, 88, 88, and 89. And what made this team special is that they had a novel offense. So Bill Walsh brought in novel NFL concepts into the NFL and combined them with a Hall of Fame caliber quarterback in Joe Montana, who was able to execute the offense. And they won four Super Bowls in 9 years. So here's another case of a team winning two Super Bowls in 4 years, 1981, 1984, And then they went on to win 4 Super Bowls total in a decade. So once again, good news for Chiefs fans because the Chiefs have won 2 Super Bowls in 4 years. Here's another example of another team doing that and winning 4 Super Bowls over a course of a decade. That's pretty incredible. Next, you have the Dallas Cowboys in the 90s. So 1992, 1993, 1995, they won Super Bowls those 3 years. And they had a strong all-around team. They were good defensively. I would say they were great defensively. They had a fairly good passing game. Their offensive line was the anchor of that team, along with their rushing attack. And Aikman's career eventually fizzled out. So they probably would have won more Super Bowls had Aikman held up. Um, in the late '90s, he was not as strong or as solid as a player as he was, and part of that was because the overall Cowboys team had started to age. Players had retired, players had left the team, so they kind of fell off a little bit, and that's why they didn't win more in the '90s. Next, you have the Denver Broncos, and they won in 1997, 1998. Gross. And the reason they didn't win more is because of a multitude of reasons. One of them is because Elway retired, and then Terrell Davis wasn't able to reach that pinnacle that he was playing at in the late '90s, and he ended up retiring after the 2001 season. Then you have the 2001, 2003, 2004 New England Patriots, the beginning of the Tom Brady dynasty. Outstanding defense, really intelligently coached team. Tom Brady playing a precision style offense, and all that led to a ball control style team that took care of the ball really well, played good defense, and was just solid all the way around. And eventually, Tom Brady signed a contract in 2005, and then he signed a larger deal in 2010. And people attribute that large contract that Brady signed in both those years as him taking a large portion of the cap. And so the Patriots did not go back to a Super Bowl for 10 years. And people attribute the salary cap hit that Tom Brady's contract took on the team meant that they couldn't find as many talented players. And so the Patriots did not go back to win another Super Bowl for 10 years until Brady kind of reworked his contract and made a more team-friendly deal. So after Brady did that, he won the Super Bowl in 2014, 2016, and 2018. And it's kind of interesting. You could try to lump the Patriots' success into one group where they won 6 Super Bowls over a 19 year span, or you can group them into 2 units. I chose to group them into 2. I think you can group them into 1 if you want. Either way, they won more than 2 Super Bowls, and the reason they didn't win more um, after 2018 was because Tom Brady was disgruntled with the player management, the personnel management that the Patriots had utilized, and chose to leave because he got tired of the lack of wide receiver and offensive talent that he was dealing with after they won their last Super Bowl in 2018. He eventually went to Tampa Bay, as we all know. That brings us to the Kansas City Chiefs. So the Kansas City Chiefs won the Super Bowl in 2019 and 2022. And if you go back through all of these teams that we just looked at, the Packers in the 60s, the Steelers in the 70s, the Dolphins in the early 70s, the 49ers in the 80s, the Cowboys in the 90s, the Broncos at the end of the 90s, the Patriots in the early 2000s, and then the Patriots in the 2010s. I think you'd have to say that all but 1 or 2 of those groups would be considered a dynasty. And the 2 that wouldn't be considered a dynasty, I would say, would be the late 90s Broncos, and then also the early 70s Dolphins. So the difference between, the Dolphins, the early 70s Dolphins, and the late 90s Broncos is that they only won 2 Super Bowls. But the reason that both those teams only won 2 Super Bowls, well, the reason the Broncos only won 2 Super Bowls is because their quarterback retired. And then the Dolphins had an interesting situation where another team came up, and it was probably the most dominant team in any decade, arguably. And that stopped the Dolphins from winning more Super Bowls. Otherwise, they would be considered a dynasty. So, what do I think in regards to the Chiefs' future? The first thing I want to ask, based on history, is there another team in the NFL who I believe can go on a run like the Steelers from the 70s or like the 49ers from the 80s? Is there another team that I believe can do that? And my answer to that question is no. I do not think that there's another team in the NFL who can go on a run like that. I think that the Bengals are close. I think that the Bills have had potential. But the problem with both the Bengals and the Bills is that the Bills have had Josh Allen at quarterback for 4 years. The Bengals have had Joe Burrow at quarterback for 3 years. We'll start with the Bills. 4 years with Josh Allen at quarterback, and they've not been able to win a Super Bowl. They haven't even been able to make it to the Super Bowl. A lot of these teams that that made it to the Super Bowl that were these dynasties, they did it within the first 3 or 4 years of that quarterback playing for that team. And so there's an old stat out there in the NFL that I believe no head coach and quarterback pairing has won a Super Bowl that didn't do it in their first 5 years. And so next year is year 5 for the Bills. And look at the competition that the Bills have to face next year. They'll have the Chiefs, they'll have the Bengals, they'll have teams that, could be scrappy like the Jaguars. And so who knows what happens with Aaron Rodgers? Is he playing in New York for the Jets next year? And so I think the door is closing for the Bills. And I wouldn't be surprised if they start making some desperate moves to try to make themselves or put themselves in the best position to have a push this year. Next, you have the Bengals, and I think the Bengals are in a better position to go on a strong run than the Bills are. And so the Bengals, Joe Burrow, great quarterback. They've played the Chiefs tough in years past. They have not won a Super Bowl. Joe Burrow has played 3 full seasons with the Bengals. So they have 2 years kind of in that window. Eventually they're going to pay Joe Burrow, and they're not going to have the same talent as before. And so next year, 2023, is the year for the Bengals. If they're going to do it, it needs to be next year. And so I think that gives them less of a chance. I still think that it's possible for the Bengals to go on a run like the 49ers in the 80s or the Steelers in the 70s, but it's much more difficult. And I would give it like I would say a 5% chance of happening. But it is possible. So, rationally speaking, regarding a team potentially coming in and having a Steelers-esque or 49ers-esque run of dominance, I don't think that team is really out there to stop the Chiefs. There are a lot of good quarterbacks in the AFC. There's a lot of good teams in the AFC. But there's only one Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid. And they're incredible. The other thing that stopped the 72 Dolphins or the early 70 Dolphins from making it to Super Bowl was that they had, or making it into a dynastic run, was that they had great players, Hall of Fame caliber players retire. And so who on this Chiefs team might retire in the next 5 years that could really, hurt their chances of going and winning multiple Super Bowls or more Super Bowls? And I will say there's 2 players that come to mind. One of them is Travis Kelce, and the other is Chris Jones. And so who knows how many more seasons the Chiefs can get out of Kelce? By all appearances, Kelce has another 2 or 3 years left in the tank where he can have meaningful snaps. And regarding Chris Jones, same could be said for him. So it's not like these players are retiring next season. There's still a window for those players, and that gives the Chiefs an opportunity to try and replace them. So I don't think that retirement is going to be a major issue for this Chiefs team. And then there's one more thing that I want to say about the Chiefs' chances for turning into one of those teams that goes on a dynastic run and wins, 3, 4, 5 Super Bowls over a decade. And that is last season. Last season with the Chiefs, their defense was ranked somewhere around the middle of the NFL. Their wide receiver core was not the envy of the league. Their running back position was not the envy of the league. And they still won the Super Bowl. And the reason they won the Super Bowl was because Patrick Mahomes is that good. And in terms of losing players, having issues with salary cap, trying to get the best guys on the roster, I think that over this next decade, as Patrick Mahomes goes into his prime, this is going to be a Chiefs team that every year can win a Super Bowl, regardless of how other defense is playing, regardless of who they have catching the ball, because Mahomes and Andy Reid are that good. If you go back at Andy Reid's early career as a head coach, prior to the Eagles getting Terrell Owens, they had a top 5 offense almost every year thrown to guys like Todd Pinkston and Freddie Mitchell. These were not teams that had tremendous wide receiver units. And so obviously you want to arm Mahomes with as many talented wide receivers as possible. But even if the Chiefs, aren't able to sign a guy like DeAndre Hopkins or nail a wide receiver in the draft, they'll be okay. They're going to be fine. And so a lot of interesting things are going to be happening next season regarding the Chiefs and this run that they're on. And the things you have to look out for are does there seem to be another team that can go on a dynastic run other than the Chiefs? Right now, if you're a betting person, the Chiefs are the team to do that. I mean, there's no questioning it. There are teams that can come in and try to throw a wrench in everything, like the Bengals. But right now, your money has to be on the Chiefs. And with all that said, looking at all of these statistics, all of this data, all these teams in the history of Super Bowl, we can say the following. And this is kind of hard to. It's kind of a complicated statement, but I think you'll bear with me here. But in the history of the NFL and the Super Bowl, there have been 5 NFL franchises who have won 2 Super Bowls in 4 seasons while their quarterback was in or going into their prime. Of those 5 franchises, 4 of them won a 3rd Super Bowl, 3 of them won a 4th. So the only one of those franchises that did not win a 3rd Super Bowl were the 72 Dolphins, as we described. And then 3 of them won a 4th. The Chiefs won in 19 and 22. So let's see where this thing goes. And I think that given the history of the NFL, given past, it's a pretty safe bet to think that the Chiefs are going to win a 3rd Super Bowl sometime within the next 5 years. And then you want to wonder if Mahomes can catch Brady and all that good stuff. We'll worry about that whenever we get closer. But I want to say to Chiefs fans, let's enjoy this ride. And I've been talking about a salary cap a lot, positions of need for the Chiefs a lot. These are very real problems that they need to address. And it's not like you can just throw whoever out there and they'll win. But boy, it sure does take the edge off whenever you're already reached the mountaintop and you know that you have the best quarterback in the NFL and you're legitimately in it every year to win the Super Bowl. And so that's kind of the place I'm standing at. What do you think? Do you think the Chiefs are the most likely team to go on a dynastic run? Do you think that a team like the Bengals or someone else can upset the apple cart that the Chiefs have rolling here? Who do you think is the most likely candidate to cause problems for the Chiefs um, over the next handful of years to keep them from becoming that dynasty or becoming that team that wins four Super Bowls in a 10-year span? What do you think? Let me know in the comments. As always, if you like what you see here, make sure that you subscribe and that you like this video. I hope you enjoyed this walk through some NFL history with me and uncovering some things about teams that have won 2 Super Bowls in 4 years. But that's all I've got. Really appreciate your time. This is Gary, signing out.
Thanks for watching this video from the team at RGR Football. Click these videos to see more and subscribe to RGR Football.